So at the end of World War II, most of Europe was in pretty bad shape. Their economies were in sharp decline. There were widespread food shortages. Governments were either unstable or non-existent, and there was a whole lot of bitterness towards the United States. But despite all this chaos, the U.S. saw an opportunity to promote democracy abroad. So they introduced the Marshall Plan, which provided billions of dollars to rebuild the economies of Western European nations. And that's what we'll be talking about today. So let's get started. The year is 1945 and World War II has just ended. Germany and Japan have surrendered. The United States is preparing to demobilize its army, and it's also dealing with a severe housing shortage, labor strikes, inflation, and a bunch of other post-war problems. But while all of this is going on, American leaders are also trying to deal with Europe, specifically Western Europe, which includes France, Great Britain, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, Greece, or Turkey, Portugal, Spain, and West Germany. The thing is, at the end of the war, these countries were in sharp decline. France and Belgium were still occupying Germany in an attempt to collect reparations. But even then, their priority was food. They didn't want any reparations until their people were fed. In fact, throughout Western Europe, millions of people were suffering from malnutrition and starvation. For example, in France, the daily bread ration wasn't lifted until 1947. In Italy, a million people were on the verge of starvation. And in Germany, there was so little food that people were eating their pets. But even if these countries had enough food, they couldn't really do anything about their industry. See, many factories in Western Europe had been bombed during the war, and the ones that were still standing were hesitant to reopen because of the worker shortage. See, while women had entered the workforce during the war, they were now expected to return home. And as a result, there simply weren't enough workers to run the factories. Also, the farmers across Europe weren't doing well because many of their farms had been neglected during the war. In fact, by 1946, Great Britain was importing almost 500,000 tons of grain just to feed their livestock. But perhaps the biggest problem facing Western Europe was the lack of raw materials. Throughout the war, the region had relied on the United States for things like oil, rubber, and metals. And when the war ended, the U.S. stopped supplying them for free. As a result, many European industries ground to a halt. And this economic stagnation led to political instability. There were protests, strikes, and even communist revolutions. In fact, by 1947, Great Britain was considering joining the Soviet bloc. Now, this may sound surprising, but at the time, the British Empire was in sharp decline. Their empire was literally half the size it was in 1914. And to make matters worse, their economy was weak, and their people were exhausted from the war. So when the British began receiving aid from the United States under the Marshall Plan, it was seen as an opportunity to restore their empire. Anyway, on June 5, 1947, the United States announced the Marshall Plan, which allocated $13 billion to help rebuild the economies of Western European nations. To put this in perspective, $13 billion in 1947 is equivalent to over $160 billion today. Anyway, the money was distributed to 16 different countries based on their level of need. For example, the country that received the most aid was France, with $2.5 billion. The country that received the second most aid was Italy, with $1.8 billion. And the only country that received more aid than West Germany was Austria. And the results were incredible. Within 2 years, Western Europe's combined GDP increased by over 50%. Industrial production rose even higher, with countries like Austria, Belgium, and France seeing over 100% growth. Additionally, trade between European nations increased by 350%. This meant that European nations were not only recovering from the war, but they were actually growing faster than before. However, the biggest beneficiaries of the Marshall Plan were the United States. You see, while the plan was primarily designed to help Europe, it also helped promote democracy and capitalism around the world. And one of the ways it did this was through the promotion of free trade. You see, in order for European nations to repay the United States, they had to export more goods to the world market. And this resulted in a significant increase in global trade. From 1946 to 1958, world trade grew from $60 billion to $200 billion. Additionally, American businesses set up shop in Europe, and as a result, transatlantic partnerships were formed. Finally, by modernizing Western Europe, the United States was able to contain the spread of communism. Before the Marshall Plan, there was a real possibility that Western Europe would fall to the Soviets. But with the Marshall Plan, not only did that not happen, but the region became a bulwark against communism.